All right, great. Yeah, thank you. All right, hi everyone. I'm really excited to be kicking off the start of this workshop for CogSci 2023, titled "How Does the Mind Discover Useful Abstractions?" So this is co-organized. I'm Wai Keen Vong, and this is co-organized with Marcelo Mattar, Lionel Wong, and Judy Fan. So the genesis for this particular workshop was, a number of different conversations with some of these folks around the idea of something that sort of like is special about the human brain. And that is the idea that we take in the raw sensory experiences and sort of distill them into useful abstractions. However, as a field of cognitive science, we've often studied these abstractions often in isolation, sort of relegating them to domains such as causality or to perception or to language or to memory. And so our goal for this particular workshop is to hold a series of different talks, each focusing on each of these domains, and then following up in person at the conference in Sydney to sort of integrate and synthesize these domains. And so for today, to kick off, we're going to be hearing on the topic or the domain specifically of causal abstractions. We're going to have 3 different talks today with some brief Q&A after each talk. So that will comprise the first half of today's meeting, followed by a moderated panel discussion where people will be free to ask questions and talk about each of the different talks from the first session. I'll briefly just say a couple of things about our speakers today. So first, we'll be hearing from Thomas Icard, who's currently a professor at Stanford University in philosophy and computer science. Then we'll hear from Zenna Tavares, who currently leads an AI research group called BASIS and is also a research scientist at Columbia. And then finally, we'll hear from Tobias Gerstenberg, who's a professor in psychology at Stanford University as well. And when we initially invited these speakers, we sort of asked them sort of 2 key questions for what to try and cover in their spiel. One is, what kinds of concrete phenomena does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? And then our second question is, what characterizes useful abstractions in the domain of causality? So without further ado, we'll get started, and I'll let Thomas take the floor.
Great, thanks so much. I'll share a screen here, if that's possible. Great, is that showing up? Yay.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, great. So I didn't know what the order was going to be, and I was going to maybe base what I said partly on what Zenna and Toby were going to say, but I'll just throw out some ideas here at the very beginning. I guess this is the very beginning of the very first of these, so I'll try to be pretty general. And thanks so much to the organizers for doing this, and it's really a pleasure to be here and also to be on this panel with Zenna and Toby. So when thinking about abstraction in general, and then I'll get kind of more into causal abstraction, there's a sense in which we kind of already always start in the middle somewhere, right? When we encounter some aspect of the world or some scenario, we are already kind of cognizing it in conceptual terms. We're already kind of carving it at certain joints that come to us in some way that's going to be explored in this workshop. For instance, if I am facing a maze, I might think of it just immediately and spontaneously in terms of like paths, which themselves are something like absences of branches and leaves. And I might think of it in terms of a goal or a hut in this case, and so on. So, immediately I think of it in certain terms, and I'm sort of carving up this scenario along certain joints. But then another remarkable feature of conceptualization is that we can move from one level to another. So I can think about this really abstractly as, oh, well, this is a maze, and maybe I just want to think about this problem of getting through the maze in terms of ways of getting through mazes. But I can also kind of zoom in and think about the leaves on these particular branches, and I can think about the space between 2 of these bushes or whatever. So, you can kind of sort of two remarkable features is one, we're already kind of in it. We're already doing some abstraction as soon as we start. And second, we can almost seamlessly move between levels or between levels of grain, if you'd like. This is I like this quotation from Dewey that abstraction, in some sense, this workshop is just about thought, because the abstraction is the heart of thought. It's all about abstraction in some really deep sense. There's another kind of peculiarity to abstraction, just in general, that it involves a kind of combination of both analysis and synthesis. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think of abstraction as something like the nominalization of abstract to abstract, going from something at one level of grain to maybe abstracting aspects of a situation, then, in some sense, what we're doing is attending to some specific characteristics or aspects or dimensions of a problem or a scenario. And that's a kind of analysis. We're kind of focusing in on something kind of specific about the scenario, but then there's also something that we're doing which could be called sort of synthesis, where insofar as we pick up on some particular aspect, we might reify that aspect and actually encode some sort of more symbolic or abstract kind of representation of the situation that might be useful for various purposes. So we're both analyzing and synthesizing when we're abstracting. And so you might want to ask, insofar as that actually also involves synthesis, so actually, populating the mind with more stuff, that should be worthwhile to do. So I take it one of the questions of this workshop is what makes for useful abstraction. So going downwards and also going upwards. And I'm just going to throw out a bunch of these and not belabor any of them, because I think they'll be most of them were already actually mentioned in the little blurb for this whole workshop at the very beginning. But stuff like prediction and induction, if it's an old theme in philosophy and science and in the theory of induction, that what kind of inductive inferences you make depends on how you carve up the world. We also presumably want to carve up the world into variables or aspects that would be useful for the purpose of action. Almost goes without saying for efficient communication. We also want to kind of maintain levels of analysis or levels of abstraction that can be integrated with one another, so that, for instance, learning or some progress we might make at one level can kind of inform other levels simultaneously. And finally, we want whatever our abstract representations to be to reflect something about the causal and counterfactual structure of the domain of interest. And that's the part that I'll focus on just for a couple of minutes before stopping. So what does it mean for some representation of causal structure to appropriately reflect the underlying true causal reality? So a number of us in this Zoom room and elsewhere often think about causal representations in terms of things like programs. So we think of programs as implicitly representing causal structure insofar as there's a kind of causal flow to the program, and that itself can serve as a kind of iconic or implicit representation of causal structure in the world. And there are also other formalisms and frameworks for thinking about causal structure that I think will be more prominent in other sub-workshops of this workshop, things like POM-DPs, which themselves have a kind of causal structure and can be even turned into programs. If you take, say, a policy for a POM-DP in an environment, then that can essentially be turned into a procedural object. And then all of these can be sort of subsumed under a very general way of thinking about just a bunch of variables having functional dependencies on other variables, maybe through time. So this kind of very general object for representing causal knowledge that might or might not have sort of psychological reality at the representational algorithmic level, but at some higher level of abstraction can actually be a kind of unifying framework for thinking about causality. If we think about things in these terms, so whether we're thinking about programs, POM-DPs, or something else, if we think about causal knowledge as encoded in something like a structural causal model, then there's a general theory that we get from about the last decade about when one causal model essentially is an abstraction of another causal model. And just to get this kind of idea on the table, imagine we have a low-level causal model I'm going to just show this very schematically, a low-level causal model that involves maybe a bunch of variables, maybe kind of too many variables. And we want to sort of cluster those together into, sort of macro variables and map the low-level clusters to the high-level clusters. You can just ask, when is one of these causal abstractions or maps from low level to the high level kind of causally consistent? And there's a way of talking about that essentially amounts to the commuting of a certain diagram. So if I have a low-level intervention at the low-level causal model, and then I map that to a high-level intervention at the high-level causal model, and then I solve the high-level causal model, then that should be the same thing I would get as if I essentially solved the low level via the intervention and then mapped that to the high-level solution to the high-level causal model. Either way you go, you should get the same thing. This is basically a way of saying that the high level and low level encode the same patterns of counterfactuals, and that's a notion of being causally consistent. So if we want to solve all these other problems about, causal abstractions being maybe more efficient or maybe have other kind of nice properties that might actually come apart from the low-level ground truth of the sort of low-level, more greater fidelity representation, then that's going to play against this notion of causal abstraction being perfectly consistent, and we can relax that to make it an approximate abstraction. Okay, so there's a lot more to say about this, but just to throw that one notion on the table, the last thing I'm going to say is not go through this because I've been talking forever, it seems like, is there's a bunch of stuff that might not be causal abstractions in this strict sense, but then nonetheless have the flavor of abstraction and involving causality in some respect. So we can come back to this if there's time, but I'll just stop right now because I've been talking more than I planned to.
Okay, thanks so much, Thomas. Does anyone have a quick question for Thomas before we move on? Maybe I'll ask one here. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk the notion that we can sort of like flexibly move between different levels of abstraction. Do you think for humans we have something almost like similar to how there's like a basic level for categories? Is there like a basic level view for causal systems or how we perceive sort of causal structures in the world?
Yeah, I think that's a great question that we should discuss more. So yeah, if you look at the uses of this causal abstraction notion in science, we usually do have a basic notion. Like there's basic measurements that you can't get any more precise than those. I'm actually skeptical about that in the human case. I mean, maybe in the session on perception, there will be, I mean, when you think about pixels or something in computer vision, maybe that's also fair. But I actually think of it more as like a fractal-like structure or self-similarity. There's kind of the default that you start with, and then you can kind of break that down and break that down and break that down, and seemingly kind of ad nauseum. So I'm skeptical about that.
Fascinating. Well, yeah. Well, because of time, we'll move on to our next speaker for today, which is Zenna. So please, Zenna, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So let me just share my screen. Yeah. Oh, can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
So thanks again for organizing this. I'm very excited to chat with everyone. I think I know most of the people here, so very excited. So I'm just gonna try to answer the questions that were given more or less directly the best I can. And hopefully we can have some interesting discussion. I'll say a couple of things in advance as a kind of preamble or precursor. So one, like Thomas, I don't have data, right? I'm not trying to explain cognitive phenomena in the form of data, more like what are some of the intuitions about, how I think we think are the things that I'm trying to say that a theory of abstraction should try to explain. And two, when we think about abstraction, I think there's various different kinds of abstraction. And I think there's a very interesting meta question of like, what is it that links together these different forms of abstraction? But the focus that I'm going to think about and talk about is on modern abstraction, so very similar to the previous talk. And finally, it would have been nice if I had a very kind of coherent picture like Thomas did, but more I've got just like kind of a scattershot of different ideas that I've been thinking about, and hopefully we can try and tie them together into some coherent narrative in the discussion. Okay, so answering this question, so what should what concrete phenomena should a theory of abstraction try to explain? So my 0th point is what I'm calling the imbuing of abstract models with understanding. And so what I'm trying to get to here is, imagine a scenario where you're trying to learn something new, you're reading a textbook, and there's some model, some abstract mathematical model or some kind of scientific model. And what I've often experienced is this process by which there's this almost like aha moment where I've tied this abstract models to some of my deeper understanding. So I can maybe try and demonstrate this with an example that we've worked on with my collaborators over the past several months or years actually. And so this project was more along the lines of, sorry, let me just, I think I've lost control. Sorry, one second. So yeah, so what I'm showing you here is an interface for a system that we've been working on and that we've built, previously published, and that's around synthesizing causal models, so synthesizing abstract causal models from observational data. But the particular thing that I want to show you is one example where we give to our system kind of video frames similar to the ones that I'm showing you now, and the system tries to infer the underlying causal model from this observational data. And so when I click, this purple thing comes down. When I press the yellow button or orange button, an orange drop goes down. And when I press blue, you can see there's a little bit of a different dynamic. And so we have a system that tries to synthesize these causal models. But as humans, you can interact with these worlds and figure out a pretty good theory about how this world works, right? But what we found, just anecdotally, is that if we tell people that this is a model of a water plug, right, that this thing is indeed water, right, and this is the plug, right, and so if I press this gray button, the plug disappears, then that often allows them to understand this world a lot better, right? And the direction of information goes both ways. Like if we tell somebody in advance that this is the model of a water plug, they're actually much more speedy in figuring out what the underlying mechanism is, right? And so, we've been looking at some of the work that Thomas has been doing and others in this kind of world of abstract causal models and connecting them from high-level models to low-level models. But what I think is the missing gap is like, what is the connection between an abstract model and understanding? What is the transition between this kind of pre-understanding state where I had a good mechanistic model to this post-understanding state where I both had the model, but I also tied it to the rest of my knowledge. And so I don't have any answer, but as what I think a theory of abstraction, or at least abstraction plus understanding, should try to explain. The next area I wanted to touch on are video games, right? So I think a theory of abstraction should explain how we're able to play video games. And so what do I mean by this? So if you look at this as the famous game Pong. So you can play Pong, and if you never played it before, it doesn't take long to learn how to play Pong. But in particular, it takes almost no time to understand what the different objects in Pong mean, right? So I can look at this paddle and say, okay, that thing represents a paddle, and this thing represents a ball, and so on. It takes longer to figure out the dynamics and how to actually be effective, but to understand the basic abstractions in the world seems almost immediate. So again, related to the previous talk, for me, a fundamental question there is, what is it that makes these abstractions pretty easy or immediate to learn or transfer? And to take a kind of a counterpoint, you could imagine a scenario where I've abstracted the world in a different way, right? An abstraction is something which ignores some details of the world. I could ignore different details of the world, which make it a lot more difficult to learn about how to play Pong. And there's been some kind of interesting results, more machine learning, where people have applied these transformations to the image data to, in some sense, corrupt it without losing information and make it very difficult for a human to learn. And I think this is interesting because it's almost a cultural thing, right? The game designer is relying on the fact that we as the game players will understand the underlying abstractions, and in doing so makes decisions about what abstractions to keep and what abstractions may not be so interpretable. And so in the space of possible abstractions, the thing I think a theory of abstraction should try to explain is, what is it that makes some kind of more stable or amenable to kind of cultural transmission than others? So a second or third point, depending on how you count, It's what I'm calling the power outage phenomenon. And some of you may have heard of this example where whenever there's a power outage, and I don't know if this is actually true or more of a myth, there's often reports that people think that they've caused the power outage, right? So they did something in their home, they turned a switch, and the power's gone off, and they think, oh, they caused it. Where in reality, it's just a coincidence. Right? And so, as we all know, causality and so correlation and causation are not one and the same thing. But sometimes it's quite useful, right? Sometimes it's quite a good heuristic to say, well, I did this thing in the world and this thing changed, and therefore I've inferred a causal relationship, right? And of all the other things that happened at that particular time, I care about this particular thing, right? And so there are some, kind of mental heuristics that we do both automatically, like kind of without our own kind of conscious decision, but also sometimes deliberatively, right? And if you look at the formalism for causal abstraction and also causal reasoning, that's not really much in the computational formalisms. Like, what is it that justifies these heuristics, right? And so what I would like to see in a theory of abstraction is a normative account where these heuristics, right, are the result of some process, maybe some rational process, some kind of optimization process, rather than just say, correlation does not imply causation. Let's think perhaps more deeply about, like, on what situations is it actually a good or useful thing to do. A third thing that we've been thinking about a lot recently is, what does it mean, or how do we maintain like multiple models of phenomena at the same time, multiple different abstract representations? And again, going to the previous talk, Thomas talked, so some really interesting work and others on, like, what does it mean for a high-level model to be an abstraction of a lower level model? And an example I often give when I think about this kind of multiple different models and multiple different levels is this question of, like, how tall is Malia Obama, right? So you can ask somebody this, and they can make a judgment about how tall they might think Malia Obama is. The thing is that they don't know, but they rely on a lot of different forms of knowledge, right? Knowledge about genetic inheritance, about presidents, and so on, right? And so the question I have is, what is it about our kind of representations of knowledge that allow us to do that? And so I would like to see, like, an understanding of this question, and the kind of answer that we're starting to tend towards is what we're calling polystructural models. So models which have, like, multiple different levels of abstraction built into the single model, related in kind of incoherent ways. And we can talk more about that and whether that makes sense. Perhaps the simpler version of this question is, what does it mean for what does it mean to have a single model or something, right? So just to break it down even further, take a map, right? In what sense is a map an abstraction of reality? Right. And so I think if we can get an answer to this simple question, I think we'd have made a lot of progress in what it means for a theory of abstraction to explain abstraction. And I think it's entirely non-trivial, right? There is this map, and in some sense it's related to the real world, but in some non-obvious way. There's not obviously a function that goes from reality to a map. There's some kind of invariances that hold, but it's not quite clear to me what exactly that means. And going to kind of the second point, what is it that makes an abstraction good or useful? And so, we're very inspired by this notion of, high level and low level abstract models. But what does it mean for an abstraction to be good? And so one of the areas that I think a lot about is computer graphics, right? And so if you've ever done computer graphics, there's these algorithms that they take these objects, and if I want to know, does object A collide with object B? One way I can do that is that I can do a kind of a more abstract test. Does a box around A collide with the box around B, right? And if they do collide, then I can do a more fine-grained test. And if they don't collide, I'm kind of confident that they, the kind of the more detailed shapes don't collide. Okay? So can we take this idea and turn it into something a little bit more general than just graphics and images? So I basically think there's a way to cash out what it means to be a good abstraction in the kind of framework of rationality, right? In other words, like, an abstraction is good insofar it is useful, right, for me to make inferences about the world relative to my kind of computational costs, right? So that's a very high level abstract version of it, right? But I think this idea can be formalized so we can get this notion of what it means to be a good abstraction, in a kind of decision theoretic framework. And this is something that I'll be happy to talk more about. So that's all. There's, again, like I said, a bunch of stuff, but hopefully it leads to some fun discussions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Zenna. We've got time for maybe one quick question if anyone wants to ask Zenna something.
Oh, okay, I'll bite. I quite like the rational formalism that you propose at the end. And I wonder if, is this something that you're actually already working on, like formalizing mathematically how like that cost function? Because I wonder if you want, if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of your performance on solving the task by maybe gaining a lot in like savings of computational cost. So I imagine there could be like a trade-off that you're willing to accept.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, right. So the challenge there is like, in some sense, they're in almost like different units, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like computational cost versus efficiency on a particular task. And so, how do you put them in a comparable unit so that you could, do some kind of like singular optimization? So to some degree, I think we need an answer to that. To some degree, we can defer that to different cases. I guess my broader claim, which we are trying to formalize, and I don't think the formalization is going to be that complex. It's just that this question of like, what does it mean to be a good abstraction has come up in a variety of different forms, both in philosophy and cognitive science. And I think we should just like, instantiate the answer to that in a rational framework, right? There are things that you want your abstraction to do, and the possession of this abstraction allows me to do this thing more effectively. And that increase in effectiveness is, in some sense, by definition, the quality of this abstraction. That's the kind of idea that I'm trying to kind of get a handle on.
But like if you're using a framework like this, why might you end up with multiple levels of abstraction where it could be completely different? I mean, if you're really like in this maximization framework, optimization framework, how might you end up with like very concrete versus very abstract abstractions,
Yeah, so I guess that's yeah, so I guess there's two different ideas that I was claiming, and I wasn't necessarily implying that some kind of rational framework would lead to these multiple different levels. But potentially it could. I mean, I think there's different kinds of questions that you want to ask, right? And at least the times when you want to ask questions which rely on perhaps multiple different models or multiple different levels, or when you have a question that relies on multiple different models or levels, right? So I could ask a very high level question about, I don't know, COVID, like, will closing the borders lead to lower, would that have led to lower levels of COVID? To answer that, I might need to go step down many different levels. It depends upon the particular dynamics of the disease and so on, right? But the question itself is phrased at a quite high level. So I imagine like the thing that requires this kind of polystructure models or multi-level models are questions which span required inference over different levels, basically.
Thanks, Zenna. In the interest of time, we might go to our last speaker for today, which is Tobias Gerstenberg. So go ahead, Toby.
Cool. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks also. Thanks so much for having me. And both Thomas and Zenna said that they're not going to be really talking about any data. I'm going to give you some data as a psychologist. I take that to be my job. And they're coincidentally aligning with the questions, I guess, that I was asked to think about in this talk. So what concrete phenomena does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? And what useful abstractions, what characterizes useful abstractions in causality? And I'm going to start with that first one here and talk about a project that my PhD student Ari Bella just put out on PsycArXiv. So he is hot off the press. So yesterday they put it out there. And so basically interested there in the relationship between language and abstraction. So how we use language to describe the world. And clearly what we say matters, right? The words we choose matter. So if you say the doctor killed the patient, or the doctor caused the patient's death, or the doctor enabled the patient's death, depending on what you say, probably different things come to mind about what happened. And we studied this in sort of simpler scenarios like the ones here, where you might see these causal interactions here between ball A and ball B, and you could think about how you would describe what happened here, what causal role A played in bringing about the outcome in this case. We were inspired by work from cognitive science, in this case from Philip Wolff, where they try to explain the use of different causal expressions, like in this case, caused, enabled, preventing, or despite, And in this case, using an abstraction, I guess, that represents, the agent and patient in each situation with these force vector diagrams, and then saying that different causal expressions map onto different configurations of force vectors. And we thought there was a lot to be, liked about this account, but that also had some limitations, that it, for example, didn't really generate quantitative predictions. And we also thought that they wanted to do away with counterfactuals, and we thought, oh, that's not really possible. So we've been developing a different account of explaining people's use and understanding of causal expressions in scenarios like these. And the basic idea is that people take in, a scenario, that they then build a useful causal abstraction of that scenario, and we incorporate that in the causal knowledge module. What this module actually does is it takes in the scene, and then it runs different kind of counterfactual contrasts to try to capture the extent to which some candidate cause, and this here, let's say ball A, made a difference to the outcome. So whether it made a difference to whether or not, for example, he went through the gate, but also maybe it made a difference to how it went through the gate. And we might also be interested in whether A was sufficient for E going through the gate so that it could have made it happen just by itself. So you start with some physical scene, and then you build an abstraction of that now captures the causal role that each object, in this case, that you're interested in, played in bringing about the outcome. So now that you've built this causal abstraction, now you need to map that onto these different causal expressions. And we wanted to module a few causal expressions in this experiment, namely affected, enabled, and caused. And the idea is that there's a then logical mapping from these different aspects of causations to these causal terms. So caused might be the most restrictive one, and then enabled might apply in more situations, and affected might apply in even more situations. And now if you have what sometimes I guess is referred to like a donut semantics like that, also have the problem that if caused is true, well, then enabled is also true and affected is also true. So now you need a way of choosing informative utterances when you want to tell somebody what happened, because again, they didn't see what happened. You just get to choose a description. And there we built, as one does here at Stanford, on the rational speech acts model as a way of choosing expressions that are now both true and informative. So we basically start with the scene and code the causal abstracts that capture the information on a high level of abstraction, define a semantics, then have a pragmatics that chooses utterances, and then it might say in this particular situation, yeah, it was A that caused B to go through the gate, rather than choosing any of these other expressions. We tested that model in 2 experiments, one speaker task, where you got to see what happened, and you had to choose what best describes what happened in this clip, and also listener task, where you saw what somebody had said. In this case, they chose that A caused B to go through the gate, and then you saw 2 different videos, and you had to say which one do you think they had seen and were referring to. And just to give you some sense, so if you have a scene like this, so it's kind of Mouchardian case where ball A bounces into ball B and B goes through the gate, and people have a preference to say caused in this case. The clip that I showed you at the beginning where it knocks it out of the way, they say enabled. And if it's a clip where ball B is already headed there and then A just bumps into it and speeds it up, they choose to say that it either made no difference or it affected its going through. And our model captures these preferences that participants have in these situations like quite well, and many more. These were just like a small subset that I chose here. And maybe as a kind of little diss on the side. So this was actually the situation that in Wolf's model maps onto enabled. And that's exactly this kind of situation up here, but nobody actually likes to say in this case that A enabled B to go through the gate. So that was sort of a little bit surprising for us. On the listener side, then we basically play the same game, but this time, right, you hear what somebody said. So maybe you heard somebody saying that ball A caused ball B to go through the gate. And now the question is, which one did they see? They see the one on the left, or did they see the one on the right? And just using our kind of generative model of this task, we can capture here that people have a preference for that one for the left-hand side when somebody said caused, and when somebody said enabled instead, people think it's more likely that it was the one on the right-hand side. Because if it had been that one, you could have said caused, which would have been more informative, more restrictive. So that's the first one. What concrete phenomena does cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? One of it needs to explain, I believe, is how we build the right causal representations for efficient communication about what happened. And their causality is, of course, key. Now, for the second question of what characterizes useful abstractions and causality, lots of things, but I'm just going to pick out one thing. In this case, with a project that Stephen Shin worked on in my lab. It's not quite as hot off the press. So the fire was a little bit shorter, in case you noticed. But this is also a paper that he's going to be presenting at CogSci actually now in the summer, learning what matters causal abstraction in human inference. And the inspiration for this came from an idea in philosophy by promoted recently by Jim Woodward, but also Stephen Yablo had talked about that, and that's the idea of proportionality. And basically what that means is that you want the causes and effects to be proportional to one another, which means that they're represented at a similar grain of granularity. So, and here's just a simple example to illustrate that. So if you have a light that can only be on or off, then you also kind of want to have a switch, right, that can only be up or down. Whereas if you have one of these fancy Edison light bulbs here, you might want to have like the dimmable one, then you might want to have a switch like that, right, that allows you to kind of in a more fine-grained way set up the light here. But you kind of don't want cross things like that. You don't want a continuous variable, for example, to then as an input when the output is only binary, or the other way around, right? So the proportional ones here are the black arrows, and the non-proportional ones are the red arrows. And now one question is of whether people spontaneously learn, I guess, such proportional representations in tasks. And as one does in causality, you often start with blickets, right? Hopefully many of you know what a blicket detector is. It's that thing here. And depending on when you put a blicket on it, it turns on. And when you don't put when you put a thing on it that's not a blicket, it doesn't turn on. So in this case, I'm going to give it away. So the cylinders here aren't blickets, and the cubes are blickets in this case. So we told participants that setup, and they had to learn basically what it was that were blickets. And it's a very easy task where there's only sort of a 2x2 of features, and participants got to play this for 16 rounds. And each time they had to just say, is the machine on or off? And yeah, basically learn this simple setting. And you won't be surprised, they don't find this particularly hard, this task. So after, 16 trials in this case, they're sort of at 90% accuracy in that task. But then, we sort of tricked our participants and confronted them with a surprise task. So after the 16th task, after the 16th trial, we just asked them, what was the thing that you had just seen on the last trial? It should be a sort of easy task in some sense, because they've just seen it, they just responded to it. And in this case, let's say for this example, it was the one here on the left-hand side. That's the one that they had actually seen. But what we were interested in is now whether we thought that people are building abstractions like of this task, because again, in this example, it was cubes that made it go and cylinders that didn't. So in some sense, you could ignore the color, right, in order to get the task right. And so we had different ideas about the kind of responses that participants might give now in the surprise task. One possibility is that they, pick the right one most of the time and then randomly choose between one of the other options. There's also a possibility they tend to choose things like based on closeness, right? So in saying, okay, this one shares one of the features, maybe it's also a cube. This one shares one of the features, it's also black. This one shares none of the features, so you'd be least likely to pick this one. Or it's also possible that the arrows would go in line with the abstraction that they learned, like for the task at hand. Whereas in this case, it's cubes that make it go, and it's cylinders that don't make it go, so that we should find something that looks more like that. And this is what we found in this particular experiment. So participants were much more likely to incorrectly recall that they had seen this scene here, where it would have still resulted in the same outcome, than this scene here, for example, which also shared one feature with the outcome, but would have led, a feature with the original trial, but would have led to a different outcome in this case. We did it in blicket world, and we also did it in ramp world. Similar idea. Here you have to judge whether this cube's going to cross the line, yes or no. And there was two features again, two different colored cubes and two different ramps. You play that for a while, and you see in this case also what's going to happen. So in this case, it's not going to cross the line. And then there was four different, again, a 2x2 and 4 different possible positions where these cubes could have ended up. And again, participants were just asked in the prediction task to say, is the cube going to cross the line, yes or no? Right? And again, we would think that they're going to learn representation. In this case, for example, red ones are going to cross it, black ones aren't, but they're going to ignore the ramps because that doesn't matter for whether or not it's going to cross the line, but it will matter for where exactly it's going to end up. And then when we surprised participants at the end with now the task that they had to say, where exactly is this cube going to end up for each of the possible combinations, we found again that the errors that they made in recalling are in line with having built an abstraction that is suited to the task at hand. So when, for example, the correct position was 1, they didn't know whether it was going to end in 1 or 2. When it was 2, they didn't know whether it's going to be in 2 or 1. And when it was 3, and so on. And if all we did, for example, is changed the position of the line such that now, we moved the line a little bit further. So it was only the blue ramp with the red cube that would cross the line. We saw a very different error pattern in this case. So now they were always correct in this trial. And when it was in these intermediate ones, you'd see that the kinds of errors that they would make was quite different from the other one, when all we did was just change the position of the line. So what characterizes useful abstractions? Useful abstractions in the causal element are proportional, often at least, so that the granularity of the cause and action representation matches that of the effect. So thanks. That was some data.
Thanks so much, Toby. Let's give a round of applause for all of our speakers for today. We'll now move into the moderated panel discussion in the remaining time that we have today. So please feel free to raise your hands or to type any questions you might have for any of today's speakers in the chat. But maybe I'll kick off the discussion. And this question is to all three of you, but Thomas and Zenna in particular. So one thing that both of you kind of emphasized was this notion of sort of multiple abstractions at different levels. So Zenna used the term polystructural for that. And I guess one thing I've always wondered is sort of like, where does like emergence or this notion of emergence come into play? It's often this notion that these high level variables sort of pop out or emerge that don't really have a good concise description at the lower level. So I'm wondering if either of you have thought about that, how it might relate to your theories on abstraction.
I can say yeah, it's a good question. Emergence is a big topic.
Yeah.
And there's I actually don't know that I have anything to say about it in the case of what minds spontaneously do. I don't know if there's anything that you can identify in thought that is an abstraction of something and lower level thought or something that it looks like emergence is happening there. But I think in science it happens a lot. So some of the standard examples of causal abstraction in the sciences are things like detecting weather patterns. So you have very low level data for like wind and temperature and stuff that you can measure. And then you do some sort of causal abstraction analysis and you get emergent phenomena, like in one study, El Nino patterns and La Nina patterns and that kind of stuff. So that really looks like something that we would genuinely want to call emergence. And I think there's stuff like that that goes on in the mind too, but that's from an external perspective, looking at minds from the outside. It's really intriguing to think that there might be stuff like that going on within the mind, but I haven't thought about it.
Yeah, I don't have that much to say other than to say I think it's worth distinguishing between kind of behavior that emerges, as a result, like new behavior that emerges as a result of many interacting entities or whatnot, versus a new perspective that we can take as kind of observers of a system, even if perhaps the behavior hasn't kind of intrinsically changed. Right, and so one is more like a top-down inference about how we model the systems, like a modeling question, and the other is like the actual dynamics have merged. And I think maybe to me those two things are a little bit different, but yeah, only a weakly held opinion.
Judy, go ahead.
Hey, I have a question that I hope will connect Toby's and Zenna's statements. So it's a question about normativity and proportionality. So during the early stages of the pandemic, at various points in time, the CDC recommended people not wear masks, and then to wear masks, and then definitely to get a vaccine. And then if you had the vaccine, then maybe masks weren't required anymore. And part of what made that really frustrating as a member of the general public was that somehow multiple interpretations were compatible with that guidance. Either that like a true underlying understanding of what caused infection and was really responsible for the pandemic was really changing, right? It could be that like the best way to protect our best understanding of what really protected you from infection was really changing. And I think that there's a kind of causal model you might build where like if you do X, like if you flip the switch, you'll be protected from infection, right? at the same time, there were other specialists in the area, maybe epidemiologists, public health folks, who like maybe had a more nuanced, richer, more graded understanding of causes and effects, maybe with multiple variables that might lead to infection, right? So these multiple like coexisting causal models that were represented in different agents in the system. And, you know, should we look at that kind of heterogeneity and simply accept it as like, well, there's just this heterogeneity, whatever it is that society finds, therefore must be the solution to some efficient optimization problem? Or is there something we can say like normatively, like, no, actually like the graded model where like masks help and vaccines help and doing both helps more? Or like that was really, really hard to communicate at the outset of COVID. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. And of course, Thomas, please feel free to jump in. You feel moved to do so. Thanks.
Want to start, Toby?
Oh yeah, you were unmuted, so I was like hesitant, but yeah, I mean, I think there's of course a certain sort of practicality to it, right? It's also saying these sort of abstract rules like stay six feet apart from someone. That's helpful, right? It's probably like more nuanced, right? In that it should be 6 feet here and should be a little bit more than 6 feet in other instances and so on. So there's a certain way I think in which like it just helps us use the sort of more abstract language to kind of coordinate well, I guess. And then I think, I mean, what sort of like, it's interesting, I guess, also to think about, although I'm not sure how well that relates to abstraction, but like what you were saying, what the underlying processes were going on there, right? Is it were people just like willy-nilly, changing their beliefs, like, or was it really like, oh, that's science, that we're figuring things out as we're going, and hence it's totally understandable, right, to see that the things should change, right? But that's not so much about abstraction. That's more like about, I guess, the public belief about how science works and what we think, rational belief formation kind of should look like.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's a super interesting question. I mean, I think it's the case that not all of these models are consistent, and not all of them are, equally good, right? Some models are bad in just like, just bad and wrong, right? And so I think, embracing heterogeneity within models doesn't mean that you have to commit to saying like everything is as equally good as everything else. And I think there are different axes upon which you might kind of consider things, right? So one axis, you could have two different models, which are different, but basically models of the same thing, but essentially making claims that are kind of incompatible. Or you might have two different models which are making kind of incomparable claims, right? They're making models about different kinds of things, maybe at different levels. And those, maybe those are broad strokes, but those two things I think are a little bit different, right? And so like, what is the right kind of framework to think about kind of comparable models, but are kind of conflicting, or maybe even making approximations and different kinds of approximations versus things which are just like entirely, maybe at some, they're all talking about the same universe, right? But they're talking about it at such different levels that I can't even say that this model is like, making comparable claims to something else. And so I would like to see more from the computational side, modeling frameworks that can actually handle that in a kind of a coherent way.
Great. We have one question from Selena. Selena, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a related question to Judy. So I was wondering, we were talking so far a bit about the proportionality from cause and effect, or like the causes need to be proportional in some way to the effects and vice versa. But I was wondering whether you have any thoughts about the proportionality of giving a causal explanation to the question you're asking. So there's some work in social structural explanation. I'm not sure if you heard of like the Garfinkel book that I thought was very interesting to think about, where he's very much like, if we want to give an explanation for why something happened, like why did the bunny get eaten by the fox, we are already specifying a level of abstraction at which we are asking the question. So there is like even a further question that you kind of have to investigate if you want to answer whether or not some explanation is useful. It's not just did your explanation answer the question, but maybe even something like, is the question a good question to ask? And is there like some further normative constraints on what kinds of questions we should be asking? So yeah, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on that. It's a very broad picture question, so sorry if that was very vague, but
I'll say something quick and then I'll pass it to Thomas. So in my case, right, the proportionality, I guess, was related to actions, right? So it was sort of like, okay, what action can I take, right? And how does that relate, you know, to the outcome of interest, right? But in some sense, you're setting out, yeah, a specific action that I can give is like give an answer to an explanation that to a why question, right? And then what shape should that take? And now I'll pass it to Thomas. Oh, maybe Thomas first.
Zenna, you should go first.
No, I don't have an answer to this question. I've got another question I want to ask. But yeah.
Oh, I see. Well, maybe just one sentence about is you know, when you're asking what you're asking the what question, what is a good abstraction? You have to say good for what, and one very specific context is explaining something to someone. But that what makes a good level of abstraction for that might be very different from what makes a good level of abstraction for that. So that's all I want to say. Yeah.
Zenna, did you have a question that you wanted to follow up with?
Yeah, well, actually, it's a quick question. I guess mostly to Toby on the experimental result that showed that people are basically attuned to discovering what abstractions will be useful in a particular task, and so it's reminding me a little bit of like the kind of the frame problem, right? Like, how do you know what's going to be useful before you've done it, right? So in this case, as far as I understood, people are actually doing the task, right, for a while, and in some sense, presumably learning these abstractions. And so I wonder, would the results be different if they didn't have like the training, right? You just kind of ask them more in advance, just from what you know about this thing. And maybe the more basic question is there a kind of chicken egg problem of like, how do you know what features of the world are useful to something prior to actually having used it for that thing? If that makes sense.
Yeah. So on the question that you asked about the abstractions forming, we have done exactly that. So I didn't have time to talk about that, but it's in the paper where if we do the training very short, on the explicit detector task, for example, then they remember almost perfectly what they had just seen, right? So it's kind of interesting because you also see like, oh, with more training, you might be doing better in the task, but in some sense, with more training, you're doing worse in the task in a certain way, because only with more training are you actually learning the right abstraction for the task and then throwing away the information that you don't need for the task. Whereas if you're still in the learning phase, you haven't quite built the right abstraction yet. So it's still encoding all of the information basically in the stimulus. So it is sort of as you're describing. And then in terms of the chicken and egg problem, yeah, that is hard, right? I feel it is very often kind of somehow general knowledge like that allows us to constrain the possible things, right, that might be difference makers in particular situations. But how that actually kind of interplays, right? How this general world knowledge together with the evidence allows us to build the right kind of abstractions that are then also quite flexible, flexibly adapting to the goals that we have, that we currently have. That's a tough one.
All right, we're getting close to time, so maybe to do one or two more questions. So we have one more from Daisuke.
Okay, yes. I have a question to Toby Gerstenberg. I'm sorry, Professor Gerstenberg. Is it all right? Okay. So that was an inspiring presentation, and I wonder if you're thinking of integrating your research with linguistic theory. That's my question.
Oh yeah, so I guess I've dabbled just a little bit in it, right? Like in that first part, and we might have to also follow up offline if you can say a little bit more exactly by what you mean with linguistic theory. But I guess at least one of the nice things about, one of the many nice things about being here at Stanford is that the linguists are just around the corner from us, and their work certainly was an inspiration for this work, right? And the best work that I had known of, or maybe not the best, but the work that I knew the most about, like within that realm, had been this work by Philip Wolff that I very briefly alluded to, that really tried to connect some of the work from what I think is part maybe of linguistic theory. So Leonard Talmy's work, like on thinking about causation and language and causation with psychological work, and that was sort of very much our building block, like for doing the work here. And we just had a different model of causation, and then we're jealous that Wolff can explain these different causal expressions, and then we kind of build on that to see like, oh, can we also, with the kind of causal framework that we have, explain the ways in which people produce and understand different causal expressions.
Mm. Your presentation reminded me of Lionel Talmy's cognitive semantics, if you know what that is. Yeah, and how causation is represented on language. And I thought it would be really interesting to take it into the consideration.
Yeah. So we're hopefully doing it justice, like in the paper. So maybe you can find the preprint, and if not, let me know. It's just a preprint at this point, so we can put more stuff of that in there.
I'll check it out. Thank you.
All right, we might wrap things up here. Let's give a round of applause again to all three of our speakers today and the really interesting discussion. If you want more, our next virtual seminar is going to take place next Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern or 9 a.m. Pacific, where we'll tackle abstractions in perception and action. So hope to see you all then. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks.